wondered about the patient experience of a clinical trial? I know you have, because you have sent me a bunch of questions about it, and today I'm going to answer them for you. My name is Jessica Bean, and today we're going to be talking about clinical trials from a patient's perspective. That's a no. I really wasn't scared at all. I had an amazing team that were working with me and that I'd known for a really long time and I really trusted. I also had reached the point in my disease where I was running out of treatment options, and the idea of not having any treatment was far scarier than taking an experimental treatment. I think the hardest part was actually trying to get onto the clinical trial, all the things that I needed to do to be eligible to participate. The workup to that trial was really huge for me, and I had to work incredibly hard to be eligible. So when I did qualify for the trial, that was actually a really big relief. Sure, it was a very big investment of my time and a very big investment of my husband's time, but when you're considering having access to a life-changing treatment, nothing seems like a really big imposition. Good question. I actually wasn't initially approached. I approached my team. I had seen the treatment coming through the pipeline. I'd done a lot of reading about this particular type of therapy, and I'd actually seen it pop up on clinicaltrials.gov and had been following very, very closely. I think this is probably reflective of patient communities in 2020 and earlier, and that we're really informed, particularly when it comes to life-changing, really significant therapies. Access to information for patients is really, really empowering. And yes, we want to make sure that they are going to accurate information sources, but we can really support them in their journey by helping them be able to understand the clinical trials process, being able to understand where to find that accurate information, and being able to advocate for themselves to participate in clinical trials. One thing that was really memorable to me was that I had to come off a number of existing medications that I was on to be eligible for the trial, and I had to make sure that I was stable enough without them, so that was challenging. I think the thing that probably wasn't anticipated and that was a real burden to me was the feeling of access guilt, the fact that I had access to this life-changing medicine, and my peers and friends in the patient community were really struggling. There was a number of patients who went through some really tough things and even passed away during the time that I was on the clinical trial. And I really carried that guilt of being the chosen one, of being the one that had those magic pills in my cupboard while others were going out without. And I recognize that the clinical trials process is really, really important to getting safe and effective medicines to market. But that still felt like a heavy load to be carrying as a patient, and something that we don't really talk about as being a burden of being involved in a clinical trial. Not a lot. The clinical trials process for me was very eye-opening. I had been a patient pretty much my whole life, but I had been a really naive patient. I would go to pharmacy each month, I would take my huge haul of medications home with me, and I wouldn't really think about much of the process that was involved in getting those medications to me. So the clinical trials process was really also an education process. I was really lucky that I had a great team at my hospital that were really open to me asking questions about the process. And it's made me the passionate advocate that I am about clinical trials and about following clinical trials, the reimbursement and regulation processes, and how patients can be involved in that. I think that one really depends on the disease community. I think there are some disease communities who have really seen the impact that better treatments have. And I think that those patients, rather than feeling like guinea pigs, often feel really grateful to access to better treatments, to the clinical trials process, and in some cases, the investments that they recognise has been made in their communities. I think then when we're talking about how we help other communities or even the broader community to share that perspective and to have that better understanding of what treatments mean, is that we're talking about providing better educational opportunities and making sure that there are appropriate resources to help patients and the community understand what the value of those trials and that process is, and also the rigor and the standard that we know exist in the clinical trials process. I think the other thing is that patients, more than ever, want to feel that they're partners in that process. They want to feel that they're involved, that they're valued, that they're communicated with, and that there's transparency within those processes. I think that building those relationships is really key to ensuring that clinical trials and the perceptions and the relationships with industry are really positive and that we can work towards those mutual benefits. Yes, absolutely. But were they the results that I expected? No, not at all. So the therapy that I was on was a really innovative type of therapy. It was a genetic-based medicine, and it was very different to any medicine that we had had previously in our community. It worked in just a completely different way. It worked on the cause of my disease rather than fixing the symptoms or working on making the symptoms more treatable. So my expectations were around old benchmarks that we'd always used for measuring efficacy and success of medicines. And the results that I experienced were life-changing, they were dramatic, they were everything that I wanted, but they didn't necessarily speak to the clinical indicators. And I think that that really speaks to the precision of the medicine, that we are entering a new area of therapies and that we have to think differently about the ways in which they work, about how we measure how they work, and about how patients need to be able to say, this is what happened for me, and to have a greater voice in that process and to have a greater say in whether a medication is valuable and successful. My favorite topics to talk about. Well, I think that's really hard for me in some ways because my experience on the clinical trial was very, very positive. I had access to a medicine that made a really big difference in my life. I felt really supported by my team, and they were great at answering my questions and making sure that I was really informed about the process. I think the hardest thing for me was that I experienced a really significant change in my life on that therapy, but the change that I experienced wasn't necessarily represented in the clinical numbers. And so I guess rationalizing that in my head was really, really hard. I think the way that I would improve that for patients then would be to make sure that patients are really involved in determining the trial design, in determining what we're looking at and how we're thinking about success and efficacy, and making sure that we're capturing all the things that matter to a patient's lived experience. And then at the end of that trial process, so that we have the right information, we have a better understanding of the impact that the medicine made, and hopefully that will make a more efficient process in being able to go through the regulation and reimbursement processes, and so that the wider patient community can have access. I hope that's given you a little bit more perspective about what it's like to participate in a clinical trial. I think it's really important that we have these conversations and that we can learn and share from one another and help partner to create a better healthcare system. Happy International Clinical Trials Day. You might never get to meet the patients whose lives that you're working to improve, but I know that they're incredibly grateful for your work. If you have more questions for me, or you would like to see the work of Patient Voice Initiative, you can find me on LinkedIn or visit www.patientvoiceinitiative.org.